There's a kind of choice that's rarely just about the choice itself. When someone says they don't eat meat for moral reasons, the gesture looks simple, even virtuous. But Machiavelli, he wouldn't buy those surface-level explanations. He'd ask, what is this decision communicating? Because for a strategic mind, moral behaviors are almost always doing some heavy psychological and social lifting that goes way deeper than what's being said out loud. We're not here to debate nutrition, animal ethics, or carbon footprints. That's the visible speech, the PR campaign. What matters here is what's behind the curtain. People who turn their diet into a moral stance aren't just picking what to eat for lunch. They're picking an identity. They're signaling belonging, distinction, and let's be real, a sort of symbolic superiority. Machiavelli would read this as the language of power dressed up in drag as virtue. The moralization of food doesn't start on the plate. It starts with a need for meaning. In a society where the big structures, church, tradition, clear-cut authority, have lost their grip, the individual goes hunting for micro-causes to anchor their identity. Eating stops being just biology and turns into a silent manifesto. I'm different. I'm conscious. I don't participate in what I consider evil. These messages don't need to be shouted. The behavior speaks for them. Machiavelli would note that any virtue displayed publicly creates invisible hierarchies. When someone defines their dietary choice as morally superior, they automatically create a contrast. Anyone who doesn't make that same choice occupies a lower rung on the ladder. You don't need to accuse anyone. The simple existence of the contrast does the judging for you. And where there's judgment, there's symbolic power. From a psychological standpoint, the payoff is huge. The person feels like they belong to an enlightened group, more sensitive, more evolved. This feeling quiets internal insecurities and organizes the world into simple buckets: right and wrong, woke and asleep, moral and immoral. Machiavelli knew that minds tired of ambiguity crave this kind of organization. It brings comfort, and psychological comfort is rarely neutral. Another big point is the displacement of aggression. Instead of expressing it directly, it gets channeled into moral judgments. The person doesn't attack, they clarify. They don't accuse, they educate. This stance allows you to exercise symbolic control without looking dominant. Machiavelli would recognize this as a refined form of power, ruling without actually looking like the ruler. Then there's the element of purification. Many who adopt rigid moral restrictions around food report a sense of internal cleanliness, not just physical but psychological. Eating meat gets associated with guilt, violence, brutality. Avoiding it becomes a way to symbolically distance oneself from what's seen as primitive or cruel. Machiavelli would understand this as an attempt at separation. I am not like them. This mechanism is especially strong in urban, intellectualized contexts. Think New York or San Francisco, where value isn't found in physical strength or production, but in sensitivity and social awareness. The dietary choice acts as a status marker, not economic, but moral. And moral status is incredibly powerful because you can't easily fight it without looking insensitive or backward. It's important to note that at this stage, the choice isn't personal anymore. It demands external validation. The person gets annoyed when they aren't recognized for their virtue. They feel a need to explain, justify, convince. Machiavelli would see this as a clear sign that the decision is no longer internal. When a choice is fully integrated, you don't need to defend it 24/7. Another aspect people rarely talk about is rigidity. When morality sets up camp in your daily habits, it tends to get inflexible. Questions are seen as attacks. Doubts are threats. The behavior stops being a conscious choice and becomes part of the ego. Machiavelli would warn that any identity that can't handle being questioned becomes fragile, even when it looks strong. The most interesting part? Many who don't eat meat for moral reasons believe they're fighting against systems of domination. But paradoxically, they end up reproducing new forms of hierarchy. They just swapped the battlefield. Instead of economic or physical power, they're fighting for symbolic clout. Instead of force, they use virtue. Instead of declared authority, they use implied judgment. Machiavelli wouldn't condemn this choice. He'd observe it coldly. He'd say the problem isn't eating or not eating meat, but turning a personal practice into a tool for identity and social control. When morality becomes a performance, it stops being ethics and starts being strategy, whether you realize it or not. This is the starting point almost no one admits. Moral choices, when put on display, are rarely just about the good they claim to defend. They also organize the world into positions, create tribes, and establish who speaks from above and who listens from below. And for Machiavelli, understanding this dynamic is always more important than getting swept up by the appearance of virtue. For Machiavelli, no widely displayed virtue is innocent. It always serves a function within a larger structure of power and belonging. In the case of folks who don't eat meat for moral reasons, the decision stops being just individual ethics and starts operating as a marker of identity and social alignment. Food turns into a symbol, and symbols, when repeated, organize invisible hierarchies. The first thing Machiavelli would spot is the need for distinction. In a society where material differences have become less obvious or harder to achieve, people look for moral distinction. Not eating meat becomes an accessible way to differentiate yourself, to signal sensitivity, consciousness, and ethical superiority without needing formal power. It's a virtue you can practice daily, visible in every meal, every declined invitation, every explanation offered. Psychologically, this meets a deep need, feeling like you're on the right side of history. You aren't just avoiding a food, you're positioning yourself morally in relation to the world. This positioning offers a sense of internal order. The world, which felt chaotic and unfair before, is now divided between those who get it and those who don't. Machiavelli knew this division simplifies reality and reduces anxiety, at the cost of complexity. Another central element is belonging. Moral choices are rarely solitary. They gain strength when shared. Groups that adopt moral dietary restrictions create their own codes, common language, shared references. This generates cohesion, and cohesion generates psychological safety. You feel like you're part of something bigger, something correct. Machiavelli would see this as the formation of a faction, not in the classical political sense, but in the symbolic one. However, this belonging requires maintenance. For the group to stay tight, you need another to define yourself against. Meat eaters become the representation of ignorance, insensitivity, or moral backwardness. You don't need to attack directly. The simple implicit comparison does the job. The group's virtue is strengthened by the existence of the contrast. Machiavelli would recognize this as an ancient mechanism. Every collective identity is defined as much by what it rejects as by what it is. There's also the strategic use of guilt. When a food choice is moralized, it doesn't stay neutral for those outside the group. It provokes discomfort. The simple act of eating a burger in front of someone who abstains for moral reasons can generate a silent tension. That discomfort is power. It shifts the moral center of the interaction. The person feeling guilty tends to justify themselves. The one justifying themselves occupies the lower position in the symbolic hierarchy. Machiavelli would see this clearly. Another relevant point is transforming the choice into a mission. Many people start avoiding meat for personal reasons, but gradually feel the need to explain, convince, educate. The decision stops being private and becomes public. This impulse doesn't just come from a desire to do good, but from the need to validate one's own identity. The more people who adopt the same choice, the more correct it seems. Morality is reinforced by numbers. Psychologically, this creates a reinforcement loop. You get approval from the group, you feel aligned with a greater cause, and you strengthen your self-image as someone conscious and responsible. External questions start being interpreted as attacks not just on the choice, but on your identity. Machiavelli would warn that when an idea fuses with the ego, it stops being flexible. And inflexible ideas tend to turn into dogmas. There's also a subtle inversion of power. By adopting a high moral stance, you don't need to demonstrate strength, competence, or explicit authority. Virtue does the work for you. Whoever questions you looks cruel. Whoever disagrees looks backward. This creates a powerful psychological shield. Machiavelli would recognize this as a form of indirect government. controlling the conversation without looking like a controller. However, this kind of power has a cost. It demands constant consistency. Any contradiction, a slip-up, an exception, a doubt, threatens the constructed identity. That's why rigidity increases. The choice stops being practical and becomes dogma. Machiavelli knew that dogmas don't strengthen individuals. They strengthen systems. The individual, in turn, becomes the guardian of their own moral image. At this point, eating isn't about food anymore. It's about position. It's about who you are, what tribe you belong to, and where you're speaking from. Machiavelli would sum this stage up simply. When a virtue needs to be displayed to exist, it has ceased to be just virtue. It has become an instrument, and instruments, when not recognized as such, end up ruling those who believe they're just doing good. When this moral identity solidifies, it starts influencing not just food choices, but how the person perceives the world, others, and themselves. Machiavelli would understand this stage as the moment when virtue stops being a choice and becomes a psychological structure. And every psychological structure, when it gets rigid, produces side effects. Internally, the moralization of food creates a constant system of self-evaluation. You start watching yourself 24/7, what you eat, what you avoid, how you're perceived. The body stops being just an organism and becomes a symbol. Eating is no longer a neutral act, it's a test of coherence. This continuous surveillance keeps the nervous system in a mild state of alert. It's not intense anxiety, but a persistent tension. Machiavelli would know that persistent states wear you down more than one-off shocks. Psychology shows that when a choice becomes central to your identity, any threat to it feels like a threat to the self. Simple questions. Why? Has it always been like this? Are interpreted as attacks. The body reacts defensively. The mind closes up. Dialogue withers. Machiavelli would recognize this as a sign of structural fragility. That which cannot be questioned needs to be overprotected. Another major effect is the externalization of virtue. You start measuring your worth not just by what you do, but by the contrast with what others do. Eating meat stops being just a different practice and becomes a sign of someone else's moral failure. This comparative gaze creates a silent hierarchy. Even without conscious intention, a subtle sense of superiority creeps in. Machiavelli would understand that all symbolic superiority exacts an internal price: emotional isolation. This isolation doesn't happen overnight. It seeps into relationships. Invitations get uncomfortable. Social environments get evaluated by the menu. Conversations get loaded with implicit tension. You feel like you need to explain yourself, and others feel like they need to justify themselves. Food, which is supposed to bring people together, starts driving them apart. Machiavelli would observe that when a symbol creates constant division, it stops serving cohesion and starts serving control. There's also the impact on the body as a regulatory system. When food is loaded with moral weight, pleasure becomes suspect. Eating starts requiring internal approval. This can lead to rigid patterns, food guilt, and difficulty listening to natural hunger and fullness cues. The body stops being the reference point and becomes subordinate to the ideology. Machiavelli would see this as a dangerous inversion, ideas governing the organism. In some cases, this rigidity disguises itself as elevated self-control. The person takes pride in their discipline, their ability to resist, their consistency. But discipline without flexibility tends to turn into hardness. The body responds with muscular rigidity, trouble relaxing, a constant feeling of containment. Psychological aging can accelerate not due to age, but due to a lack of internal fluidity. Another rarely discussed effect is the dependence on recognition. When virtue is put on display, it expects a return. Looks of approval, admiring comments, social validation. When that return doesn't come, silent frustration sets in. You feel like you're doing the right thing, and yet you're not being recognized. This internal resentment weakens the choice itself, but the mind reacts by doubling down on the dogma instead of questioning it. Machiavelli would understand this is a common mistake, turning a practice into a flag and then becoming a hostage to it. The more your identity depends on the practice, the less freedom you have to adapt it. Any adjustment starts to feel like a betrayal of self. The choice, which was supposed to serve the person, starts demanding absolute loyalty. At the deepest psychological level, excessive moralization creates an internal split between pure and impure. The body that follows the rule is seen as correct, the one that fails as guilty. This split doesn't stay restricted to food. It spreads to other areas of life. People like this tend to judge with more rigidity, including themselves. The world becomes less tolerable, less ambiguous, less human. Machiavelli would end this observation with caution. When a virtue begins to harden the individual, it has ceased to be a strength and has become a limit. Real power isn't about never making a mistake, but knowing how to adjust without losing sovereignty. And any moral system that turns the body into an internal battlefield ends up producing exhaustion, even if it presents itself as higher consciousness. When this pattern drags on over time, the moral choice stops being just an identity and starts shaping the person's social and psychological destiny. Machiavelli would note that any virtue sustained by constant contrast inevitably creates a field of tension, not just with others, but with oneself. Because living in permanent opposition requires vigilance, defense, and continuous reaffirmation. And that comes with a bill to pay. One of the first costs shows up in relationships. People who turn food into a moral criterion start filtering the world through that lens. Friendships become more selective. Environments get evaluated not by affection or connection, but by ideological compatibility. The result is a gradual shrinking of the social circle. Not because others are rejecting them, but because they start silently rejecting anyone who doesn't share the same moral footing. Machiavelli would understand this as a classic strategic error, reducing potential alliances in the name of symbolic purity. In any power structure, the stricter the criteria for belonging, the smaller the reach. You might feel more consistent, but you also become more isolated. Isolation, even when chosen, weakens you. There's also a cumulative effect on communication. Simple conversations gain implicit layers of judgment. Neutral comments are interpreted as provocations, jokes as attacks. The body reacts to this constant reading with tension. Tight shoulders, locked jaw, short breath. The organism starts preparing for conflict even when there is none. Machiavelli knew that preparing too much for confrontation creates enemies where there could have been allies. Another major cost is the difficulty in dealing with contradictions. Real life rarely fits perfectly into moral categories. Complex situations require nuance. People who lean heavily on rigid moral identities tend to suffer when reality doesn't back up their expectations. Frustration arises, resentment, and in some cases, cynicism. The virtue, which was supposed to guide, starts to disappoint. From a psychological perspective, this generates silent wear and tear. The mind has to work constantly to maintain coherence between speech and practice. Any exception needs to be explained. Any doubt needs to be repressed. The body feels this pressure as chronic fatigue, not the physical tiredness of effort, but the mental tiredness of sustaining a narrative 24/7. Machiavelli would observe that this kind of wear reduces adaptability. Instead of responding to circumstances with intelligence, the person responds with rigidity. Instead of negotiating, they impose. Instead of observing, they judge. This stance might generate a momentary feeling of superiority, but it weakens the position in the long run. Rigid people lose influence because they become predictable. There is also a direct impact on the relationship with pleasure. When daily choices are loaded with moral weight, pleasure becomes suspect. Eating, socializing, celebrating become monitored acts. The body loses spontaneity. The mind loses lightness. Machiavelli would understand this as a waste of vital energy. Pleasure, when managed well, strengthens. When repressed in the name of displayed virtue, it sickens. Another point rarely discussed is the inversion of responsibility. When moral identity becomes central, any discomfort experienced by the person tends to be blamed on the incorrect world. The problem is never the rigidity of the choice, but the insensitivity of others. This logic prevents fine-tuning. You protect yourself from doubt, but you also deprive yourself of growth. As the years go by, this pattern can generate a vague sense of stagnation. You stay faithful to the same flag but feel like something isn't evolving. The virtue repeats itself, but it doesn't deepen. The rhetoric remains, but life doesn't expand. Machiavelli would say that any strategy that doesn't adapt to the times ends up losing effectiveness, even when born of good intentions. At the deepest level, the cost is internal. The person starts confusing value with correctness. Being right becomes more important than being whole. The body feels this fragmentation as a loss of vitality. The mind feels it as stiffness. The world starts being seen in black and white. And Machiavelli knew that those who see only extremes lose the capacity to govern complex territories. This is the point where virtue stops being a strength and becomes a prison. Not because the choice itself is wrong, but because it was elevated to a place where it can no longer be questioned. And anything that cannot be questioned starts, sooner or later, to rule those who believed they were in control. Machiavelli would wrap up this analysis not by attacking the choice itself, but by putting it back in its proper place. Because for him, the error is rarely in the isolated act, but almost always in the psychological function that act begins to serve. Not eating meat for moral reasons is not in itself weakness or virtue. What defines its strength or danger is whether the choice serves the individual, or if the individual has started serving the choice. The first necessary reframe is understanding that morality is not identity. When a daily practice becomes the core of the self, it stops being a tool and becomes a throne. You don't just do something, you are that thing. Machiavelli would say that any rigid identity weakens you because it reduces your maneuvering room. The more you need to protect a moral image, the less freedom you have to adapt without feeling like you're betraying yourself. Psychologically, recovering internal sovereignty means taking the dietary choice out of the field of judgment and bringing it back to the field of decision. A decision doesn't require applause, it doesn't require agreement, it doesn't require constant defense. When someone is truly in command of themselves, their choices don't need to be explained all the time. They simply exist. The body feels this repositioning as immediate relief. Machiavelli would advise something simple and uncomfortable. Stop using virtue as a language of power. This doesn't mean abandoning values, but stopping the transformation of them into an instrument of distinction. The most solid power is the kind that doesn't need to be signaled. Someone who truly rules doesn't need to show off. Someone who is secure doesn't need to convert others to validate their own position. Another essential point is reconciling with complexity. Real life doesn't organize itself into absolute moral categories. Accepting this isn't weak relativism, it's strategic intelligence. People who can sustain ambiguity without anxiety tend to have more clarity, more presence, and more influence. Machiavelli knew the world belongs to those who understand nuance, not to those who need to simplify it to feel right. On a physical level, this repositioning generates deep changes. When food stops carrying excessive moral weight, the organism recovers sensitivity. Eating goes back to being a dialogue with the body, not a test of character. The tension drops. Pleasure stops being suspect. The nervous system exits surveillance mode. The choice now serves life, not the ego. There's also an important shift in relationships with others. When virtue stops being put on display, judgment loses its bite. Interactions become lighter. The individual no longer needs to educate, convince, or correct. They observe, they select, they position themselves when necessary. Machiavelli would understand this as the maturing of power. Less confrontation, more effectiveness. This doesn't mean abandoning convictions. It means owning them without turning the world into a courtroom. Strong convictions don't need to humiliate other positions to remain standing. On the contrary, the more a conviction tolerates the existence of the opposite, the more solid it is internally. Rigidity isn't a sign of strength. It's a sign of fear of collapse. Machiavelli would summarize this exit strategy directly. Those who turn choices into flags end up marching all the time, and they get tired. Those who turn choices into strategies know when to act, when to shut up, and when to change without feeling defeated. Real power isn't about being morally superior, but about not being governed by the need to appear virtuous. In the end, it's not about the meat. It never was. It's about sovereignty. It's about who decides, the individual or the identity they built. As long as the moral choice governs the person, they live in constant defense. When the person governs the choice, they live with strategic lightness. And Machiavelli would make it clear, a virtue that imprisons isn't virtue. It's a mechanism. The true advantage lies in acting according to your principles without needing to turn them into a stage. Because those who really have power don't need to prove they're on the right side.